I was the only one in white that morning. A crisp suit, sharp heels, and a calmness in my chest that felt unnatural in the middle of Novacor's chaos. Around me, the office was cracking apart. Voices rose, phones rang off the hook, and people whispered their resignations like secrets at a funeral. At exactly 10 o'clock, Kieran walked into Malcolm Drexler's office and laid down his resignation. At 10:05, Rowan followed. By 11:30, half the team was gone. Malcolm, my manager, my executioner for 7 long years, paced the floor like a cornered predator, his polished mask slipping with every step. He barked at HR through one call, snapped at a client on the next, then turned to glare at me as though I were pulling the strings. And, in a way, I was. Because none of this was an accident. Every box being packed, every chair left empty, every client call that went unanswered, I had set it all in motion months before. The cruelest part? Malcolm still thought he was in control. He believed he was the one holding the strings, when in truth, he'd been tangled in mine for a long time. And standing there, watching him unravel, I couldn't help but think about how it all began. 7 years earlier, I had walked into Novacor full of belief. I believed in hard work, in recognition, in the glossy promise they fed us in brochures. If you stay loyal, we'll take care of you. But that promise was a lie. Before I take you deeper, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, if this were you, what would you have done? Would you stay silent, or would you fight back? I had been one of their brightest strategists, the person clients trusted when everything was on fire at 3 in the morning, while Malcolm slept soundly. And yet, every success of mine was handed to him. Every idea I nurtured ended up on his slides. And every mistake the team made, somehow it was pinned on me. And he never forgot to add the sting. You're sharp, Evelyn, but too emotional for leadership. Or worse, the half-smile he gave after stealing my pitch. Relax. We're a team. A team. What a joke. I went to HR. They looked down at their notepads and scribbled platitudes. Nothing ever made it into a file. Malcolm was too well-connected, too charming in executive meetings. That's when the realization sank in. I wasn't invisible. I'd been erased. So I made myself a promise. If I can't be seen, I'll be remembered. I became a ghost. At first, it was subtle. I stopped challenging him in meetings. I stopped defending myself when he cut me off. I became quiet, obedient, the perfect shadow. Malcolm thought I had finally learned my place. What he didn't realize was that I was learning his. Every careless email, every off-the-record comment, every slight he thought no one noticed. I noticed. And I recorded. That's when I built the folder, encrypted, hidden, untouchable. I called it the ghost contract. Inside, I gathered teeth, resignation templates, salary benchmarks that proved just how badly Novacor underpaid us, coaching notes for interviews, secret recordings of Malcolm mocking staff with anxiety, screenshots of HR burying complaints. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed people. So I started mentoring in whispers. Kieran wanted out but didn't know where to start. I showed him how to package his portfolio until a London agency scooped him up. Rowan doubted herself until I rewrote her resume. She landed in Berlin. Imogen felt stuck until I coached her through fintech applications. She left with triple her salary. Even Mia, our intern, discovered her worth and built a freelancing business that paid more than Malcolm ever offered. One by one, they escaped. The office grew emptier, the silence heavier. And still, Malcolm shrugged. They're weak, he said. I'll replace them with stronger people. He had no idea the noose was tightening. I chose March 27th, 1 week before our biggest client presentation. It was not a random date. It was the moment where the smallest crack could shatter everything, and I wanted to be the one who pushed the first domino. That morning the plan began to unfold. At 10 o'clock, Kieran walked into Malcolm's office holding his resignation letter. I could see through the glass walls as he placed it on the desk with calm certainty. Malcolm's mouth opened like he was about to argue, but Kieran did not give him the chance. He stood tall, nodded once, and walked out. 5 minutes later, Rowan followed. She did not even sit down. She left her letter on the desk and walked away with her bag slung over her shoulder, her steps confident and final. By 11:30, the office felt like it had been gutted. Half the team was gone. The people who carried the weight of the company had all decided that today would be their last day. Desks were being cleared, boxes were being filled, and the sound of tape ripping across cardboard replaced the usual hum of keyboards. Malcolm was losing control. He stormed across the floor, shouting at HR, demanding explanations, snapping at clients on calls he could not afford to lose. His voice was louder than the phones ringing around him, but behind the anger there was something new in his tone. Panic. His polished mask, the one he wore so carefully in meetings with executives, was slipping. Everyone could see it. I sat at my desk quietly, working as if nothing had changed, my face neutral, my pulse steady. Inside, I felt a calm that had been missing for years. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to move a single piece of paper. Everything that was happening was already set in motion long before today. At noon, Mia walked in. She was no longer the nervous intern fetching coffees and carrying notepads. She was dressed sharply, her chin lifted, her eyes locked on Malcolm. She placed a plain white envelope on his desk and said in a clear, steady voice, "Your surprise arrives at 5." The room froze. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Chairs stopped rolling. Everyone heard her. Malcolm's face went pale, then red, then pale again. His hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly, I thought the wood might crack. He looked at her, then at me, and then back at the envelope. He did not touch it. He did not open it. He simply stared as if it were ticking. By then his hands were shaking. Mine were still. The hours that followed felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Clients flooded his inbox, demanding updates that no one could provide. HR called his office again and again, asking why half the staff had vanished. The board scheduled an emergency call, and I could hear his voice leaking through the glass walls, frantic and defensive. He blamed everyone but himself. He called the employees weak. He accused HR of being careless. He even cursed IT when files refused to open on his screen. Each excuse made him smaller. Each scream chipped away at the authority he had built for years. People stopped listening to him. Some rolled their eyes openly. Others packed up quietly, certain they were next. By 3:30 his shirt was damp with sweat, and his tie hung loose around his neck. His hair, always perfectly styled, clung to his forehead. He looked less like a leader and more like a man cornered with no way out. I passed his office at 4 and paused for a moment. Papers were scattered across his desk, his phone buzzed nonstop, and his computer beeped with unanswered messages. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and hissed, "This is your doing." I smiled softly, tilting my head, but said nothing. Silence can be sharper than words. At 4:45, the office fell into complete quiet. The envelope still sat untouched on his desk, and yet its presence filled the room like smoke. No one wanted to be the first to leave. Everyone was waiting for the clock to strike. Malcolm's eyes flicked back and forth between the envelope and the time. At 4:55, he finally broke. He stormed out of his office, his voice raw and desperate, and shouted, "Who's behind this? Who thinks they can ruin me?" No one answered. Not one person came to his defense. The man who had ruled with fear now stood completely alone in it. I looked at my watch. 5 minutes until 5. I was not nervous. I was not angry. I was not even excited. I was simply ready. The real storm had not hit yet. It was waiting, counting down. And when the clock struck 5, Malcolm would finally understand what it meant to be haunted. 5 o'clock. The second the clock struck, the office changed. There was no sound at first, just the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights. Then, like a silent explosion, the first email alert flashed across HR screens. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, their inboxes were flooding with recordings. Malcolm's voice, crystal clear, filled their speakers, mocking an employee for having anxiety, laughing about people being too soft, and belittling the very team that kept his projects alive. Across the floor, HR staff froze, their headphones slipping from their ears. You could see the shock written on their faces. Their hands hovered over keyboards, unsure if they should delete, report, or simply listen in horror. At the same time, the board of directors received a different set of messages. Screenshots. Dozens of them. Every buried complaint. Every ignored report. Every email where Malcolm brushed off harassment, or worse, actively covered it up. For years they had trusted him to manage the team. Now, in their inbox, was proof that he had been the source of the rot all along. Our biggest client was next. They opened an attachment labeled Urgent. Internal misconduct. Inside were clips of Malcolm, careless and smug, calling their staff idiots and dead weight. It was like setting fire to a bridge while still standing on it. The client's reply came within minutes, a termination of contract notice, effective immediately. But the most devastating blow did not come from outside. It came from inside his own account. Scheduled weeks earlier, from Malcolm's personal email, a single message appeared in the board's inbox. The subject line read, "Confession." The body of the email was short. "I failed this team. Elite." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. By 5:15, LinkedIn posts began to appear. By 5:30, Twitter threads had taken over the timeline. Employees who had left shared their stories. Clients weighed in with their frustrations. Screenshots were shared, reshared, and dissected. Every ugly truth that Malcolm had worked so hard to bury was now alive, multiplying, impossible to contain. The office descended into chaos. Malcolm stormed into HR demanding to know who had leaked the files. His face was red, his tie hanging loose, his voice cracking as he shouted threats that no longer carried weight. But the more he yelled, the more people pulled out their phones to check the news. Every new refresh brought another wave of exposure. His reputation was collapsing in real time, and he could not stop it. By 6 o'clock, the first call came down from the board. Malcolm was suspended pending investigation. His access card was deactivated. His laptop locked him out. He was no longer a manager. He was just a man standing in the middle of an office full of people who could finally see him for what he was. That night, the news spread like fire across the city. Industry blogs picked up the story. Hashtags began trending. Reporters were calling former employees for comment. Malcolm's name, once polished and respected, was now tied to words like toxic, abusive, and fraud. By dawn, he was everywhere. His photo, once used for glossy Novacore ads, now flashed across news feeds with captions like the fall of a corporate tyrant. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own stories of managers just like him. He had become a symbol, not of leadership, but of everything wrong with it. By the end of the week, Malcolm was radioactive. Recruiters avoided him. Partners cut ties. Even the executives who once laughed at his jokes were now deleting photos where they had stood beside him. His name was no longer an asset. It was a warning. Novacore itself began to collapse under the weight of the scandal. Clients withdrew, investors panicked, and staff who had not already resigned started updating their resumes in plain sight. The building that once buzzed with ambition now hummed with dread. Every meeting was an emergency meeting. Every call felt like a crisis. And me? I sat in the middle of it all, calm, still, the only one in white that day. For the first time in 7 years, I felt weightless. The chains Malcolm had placed on my career, my voice, my name, They were gone. I was free. Or so they thought. Because freedom was never the end game. It was only the beginning. Malcolm's downfall was not just revenge. It was the first step of something bigger, something no one at Novacor could see yet. While they panicked, while Malcolm's name burned, I was already 3 steps ahead. They thought I was finished with Novacor. What they did not know was that Novacor was finished because of me. And soon, the industry would learn the truth. Ghosts don't just haunt. Ghosts dismantle. Here's the truth nobody saw coming. Everyone thought the resignations were random. They thought my team had scattered into different jobs, different countries, different industries. That is what Novacor's executives told themselves to sleep at night, that people just moved on. But nothing about it was random. Not one resignation. Not one exit. Not even the timing of their departures. I had guided each step. And every single one of them had landed in the same place. Halcyon Dynamics. Novacor's fiercest rival. The company Malcolm used to mock in meetings, saying they were a few years behind. The competitor executives feared, but never admitted out loud. The one name that could make investors squirm if it appeared in the same sentence as Novacor. While Novacor was bleeding, Halcyon was preparing to roar. And I was the bridge between the two. I wasn't unemployed. I wasn't lost. I was walking straight into my new office at Halcyon with a nameplate that read, Director of Talent Development. Years earlier, Halcyon had tried to recruit me. They had seen my work, my results, and they wanted me on their side. Back then, I could have accepted. I could have escaped Novacor quietly, found peace in a new role, and left Malcolm behind. But that would have been too easy. Too clean. And it would have left him standing, smirking, taking credit for years of my effort. So I made Halcyon a counteroffer. Let me stay inside Novacor, I told them. Give me time. I'll dismantle it from within. When I walk, I'll bring you their best people and leave the rest in ashes. It was a dangerous deal, and Halcyon knew it. But they agreed. They waited. They gave me resources when I needed them. They helped me shape opportunities for the people I mentored. They didn't ask questions. They trusted me to finish the job. And I delivered. Kieran's job in London? Secured with Halcyon's contacts. Rowan's Berlin placement? Funded quietly through one of Halcyon's partner firms. Imogen's fintech leap? Opened by Halcyon's recruiters. Even Mia's freelancing network was boosted with Halcyon's connections. None of them knew the full truth at first. They just thought I was helping them. They had no idea I was building a hidden army, carefully placing them where they would later converge. When the time came, Halcyon welcomed them all at once. One by one, they received offers. Not just jobs, but senior positions. Better pay. Respect. A company that valued their skills instead of crushing them. By the time I walked into Halcyon's headquarters, my team was already waiting. Not broken. Not scattered. Stronger than ever. Standing together. Novacor had not just lost employees. They had lost their core. The very people who kept the wheels turning were now sitting across the street, working for the enemy. That was the real twist. The detonations, the leaked emails, Malcolm's public humiliation, those were only the surface. The true damage was invisible until it was too late. Novacor was hollowed out from the inside, its best people transplanted into the very rival it feared most. When I stepped into my office at Halcyon, the difference was immediate. There were no fake smiles. No polished lies. No one calling me too emotional. They listened when I spoke. They respected the scars I carried. They called me by my name. But make no mistake, this was never about comfort. It was about power. At Novacor, Malcolm had taught me a cruel lesson. If you let someone else control the story, they will erase you. At Halcyon, I had rewritten the story. And now I was the one holding the pen. I was never just Evelyn Cross, forgotten strategist. I was Halcyon's ghost. Every whisper I planted, every resignation I timed. Every lie I let Malcolm tell while I recorded in silence. It all built to this moment. The boardrooms were still shaking from his downfall, and I was already preparing the next phase. The industry would look at Novacor and see a scandal. They would look at Halcyon and see growth. But if they looked closely enough, they would see the same fingerprints on both.
Mine.
And here's the part that still makes me smile. Malcolm never understood. Even in his final hours, red-faced and screaming, he believed he had lost control because of bad luck or weak staff. He thought he was the victim of circumstance. He never realized he had been living inside my plan for years. When I signed my contract to Halcyon, their CEO shook my hand and said, "You've done more than we expected." I simply replied, "That was only phase 1. The world thought the story ended when Malcolm was suspended. They thought Novacor's collapse was the end of my fight. But ghosts don't stop at one haunting. Ghosts move on, leaving ruins behind them." And as I stood in my new office, sunlight streaming through the glass, surrounded by the very people Malcolm once called weak, I felt the shift. Novacor had fallen. Halcyon had risen. And me? I was already looking at the next target. Because when you've spent years being erased, there is nothing sweeter than writing your name in fire. As I stepped out of Novacor's glass doors for the final time, I turned to look back at the building. It was strange. For years it had towered over me like a monument, a place that decided whether I mattered or not. But that afternoon, it looked smaller.
Hollow. Broken.
The guards at the entrance avoided my eyes. Some of the employees who still lingered on the sidewalk whispered to each other when they saw me leave. They knew something had happened, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the ghost who had haunted Novacor was now walking free. My phone buzzed. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Envelope with arrow message from Halcyon CEO. Target neutralized. Phase 2? I slipped on my sunglasses and smiled. The city reflected off the dark lenses as I whispered, almost to myself, "Send me the next company." Most people would think the story ended there, that I had finally won. But the thing about revenge is that it changes you. Once you've seen how fragile power really is, you can't stop. It's like watching glass shatter. You start wondering what else might break just as easily. Halcyon knew this about me. That's why they trusted me with more than just one mission. They didn't just see me as an employee. They saw me as a weapon. And weapons don't retire. The second message came only minutes later, encrypted and hidden inside an innocuous news alert. I opened it on the train ride home. Target, Titan Global Consulting. I felt a chill, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Titan was bigger than Novacor, richer, and far more ruthless. They dressed their cruelty in glossy magazines and charity galas, but anyone who had worked there whispered the same words: exploitation, burnout, betrayal. Their executives were predators in designer suits. Halcyon wanted me to do what I had done at Novacor, dismantle them from the inside. Only this time, the stage was larger, the risk higher. The fall, if I pulled it off, catastrophic. I leaned back in my seat, watching the city pass by, and thought of Malcolm. Just a week ago, he was untouchable, admired, feared. Now he was a headline, a warning, a man nobody wanted to be seen with. That was what power was. Not strength, not respect, just reputation. And reputation can be erased in hours. That was my skill. That was why Halcyon trusted me. I didn't just fight toxic managers. I rewrote the stories companies told about themselves. But this time, I wanted more than just erasure. Novacor's fall had been personal. Malcolm had stolen my voice for years. Titan would be something different. They would be the proof that no empire is safe when the ghosts are watching. When I got home that evening, I opened my laptop. The ghost contract folder had grown fat with Novacor's evidence. I copied it to an archive, locked it, and then created a new folder. The Phantom Ledger. This one would not be about one man. This one would be about a whole machine. I began gathering threads. Employee reviews buried on anonymous forums. Old lawsuits that had been quietly settled out of court. LinkedIn profiles of people who had left after less than a year. Each piece was small, almost meaningless on its own. But I knew better than anyone. It is never one wound that kills a company. It is the 1,000 cuts you cannot see until the blood pools. The more I read, the more I realized Titan's mask was even thinner than Novacore's. Behind their shiny glass headquarters and expensive branding were cracks. Deep cracks. Employees burned out in months. HR dismissed harassment claims as misunderstandings. Managers bragged about 20-hour shifts like they were medals. The culture was poison, wrapped in glitter. And I smiled, because I had seen this before. As I closed the laptop, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Halcyon. We want Phase 2 to be faster.
Can you handle it?
I typed back only 2 words. Watch me. Walking into Novacore that last morning in white had been my declaration of war. Now, as I packed for my first visit to Titan's headquarters, I chose black. Not mourning. Not grief. Black, because it absorbs light. Black, because it is the last thing you see before everything fades. People think ghosts wander, that they drift, searching for unfinished business. But I know the truth. Ghosts don't wander. They hunt. And I had just found my next hunt. When the dust settled and the headlines cooled, I found that revenge did not land like a single thunderclap. It braided itself into the small, quiet parts of my life. I woke up without the nod of second-guessing. I slept without rehearsing my apologies. I walked down streets that no longer belonged to a man who had built a kingdom out of taking credit. Those were the small freedoms people imagine when they hear the word victory. They are real, but they are not the whole story. What surprised me was how empty the applause felt. People called and sent congratulations, but most of those voices wanted a headline, not a conversation. My old colleagues who had survived the chaos stitched new routines. Some found better work. Some drifted. A few looked at me with something like fear, as if my calm had been a contagion. I realized then that dismantling a machine also scatters its parts. There are faces you once knew who will never look the same again. The bigger surprise was the change it forced inside companies.
Borchmet.
HR policies were rewritten. Training modules were produced that never would have existed without the scandal. That felt useful, proof that something had shifted beyond my personal score. The work of so many people who had been sidelined finally had a louder stage. That more than my name on a title mattered. But there was also a cost I had not budgeted for. The habit of hunting. Once you learn how a domino falls, you start to notice other walls balanced on tiny cracks. Power becomes a map with pinpoints. You begin to wonder how many other buildings are waiting to be emptied. So tell me, if you were a ghost in your workplace, what would you haunt? Would you break a single window or bring the whole house down? Music fades. Screen goes black. And if you liked this story, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more shocking tales. Click the box on the left. Your next adventure is waiting.